los terroristas.
And do the Harlem Shake.
In the 1920s, there was a cultural movement called the Harlem Renaissance. This event was classified as the New Negro Movement and was mainly located in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City. This movement was not specific to a single location, as it also influenced many French-speaking black writers in Paris. Prior to the Harlem Renaissance, most African Americans were enslaved in the South until the Civil War. The emancipated African Americans began to fight for equality in all aspects of life. They had some success as several African Americans had been elected in Congress and the Ku Klux Klan Act was enacted. However, prejudice still existed in the Southern white community. White Democrats passed legislation that continued to oppress the rights of African Americans, such as segregation, terrorizing black communities with lynch mobs, sending African Americans to work jobs in brutal conditions for no pay, and other violent acts. These struggles are what led to the Great Migration of the Harlem Renaissance. This was the time period when African Americans moved from the South to the North to escape discrimination, oppression, and racism. The Great Migration led to Harlem becoming a cultural center with a growing African American middle class population. The increase in population in the Harlem community led to the native white middle class inhabitants to leave, allowing Harlem to become a predominantly African American neighborhood. Lynchings and race riots began for African Americans in defiance of racism. This was when Hubert Harrison rose as the father of Harlem radicalism, starting the Liberty League and a newspaper for African Americans' voices to be heard. African Americans took over the culture of Harlem, and thus the Harlem Renaissance began. All of these events sparked a flow of creative expressionism with music and poetry, so we are going to take you on a journey of understanding what the poetry is expressing.
Wow, I would hate for that to happen to me. Oh, I know, that really sucks, being taken advantage of like that. You know, this kind of thing used to be really common. Back in the day, this is what happened to many African Americans living in North America. In fact, they were actually treated worse. Oh, yeah, I think I remember learning about that in school. Do you guys remember reading that poem by Count Follett? Yeah, I think I remember learning that. Yeah, the whole poem revolves around the artist expressing that he feels that people should not put up with others taking advantage of them. You know, the line, we shall not always plan while others reap. That's him saying that people shouldn't let others benefit from their hard work. Isn't there a line like, white stars know that less lonely being here? Yeah, that's cool saying that African American people are just as important and worthy as Caucasians. And when he says, though there are buttons that cannot bloom at all in life, but crumble hideous and fall, he's saying that the color of someone's skin doesn't determine their morality. Oh, okay. Isn't that cool just about how African Americans were holding it how they felt? Yeah, pretty much. Wait, do you guys know why it was called the Dark Tower? If I remember correctly, I think the Dark Tower was placed on 136th Street in Harlem, where writers would gather to write poems and express their thoughts. Well, that's an interesting title, because that's exactly what Cullen was doing in his poem, just expressing his thoughts. Did you know that the sonnet is actually a really weird thing, because it's typically a European male way of expressing love, but this poem obviously isn't.
During the Harlem Renaissance, such female dancers were quite common, and they are mostly of the black descent. Young men would enjoy their drinks and laugh while upbeat music drowned out their drunken laughter. We can study the themes of sex, youth, and promiscuity in this poem.
This young black female is under cruel judgment and hidden emotions are revealed within the dancer, who is objectified and under the audience's prejudices. In the first line, the audience is described as applauding youths, but that innocence is quickly swept away when the dancers are next addressed as young prostitutes.
These young men are captivated by her body's swing and the sexual appeal she has at such a young and innocent age. The elements of sexuality and innocence that are portrayed in such a contrasting way set the tone for the rest of the poem.
The theme of pride is greatly shown in this poem as the woman is proud of who she is, a strong, beautiful black woman proudly slaying with no shame. The colorful imagery the writer uses to describe the dancer almost makes it seem as if he thinks that she is too good for what she is doing and that a price cannot be placed on this beautiful woman.
The poem uses expression to exhibit how a woman was viewed at the time, animalistic and not valuable. The use of personal pronouns me and I really make it personal for this young dancer and allow readers into her mind of mixed emotions in this time of prejudice and judgment.
In The Negro Speaks of Rivers, the general summary is that the narrator has lived for a very long time, thousands of years or so, to be able to witness such events like the pyramids being raised and Abraham Lincoln riding down the Mississippi.
This vastly extended lifetime has caused our narrator to become very worn, for lack of a better word. Specifically, he states that his soul is as deep as the bed of a river, which words assume is because of his evident immortality.
Another connotation is that the writer is using a multitude of people as his one single narrator, as some sort of collective voice or consciousness.
As a whole, if these people were able to combine their experiences and opinions, then their souls would create a very deep and well-rounded mega-soul.
It can also be taken that by having a collective viewpoint, Hughes is unifying the African Americans and showing them just how similar their lives, history, and experiences are.
I cannot wait until school is over. There's only like 84 days left. Thank God. You got that right. School's way too hard. This sucks.
I couldn't help but overhear you two girls talking about your problems. And I wanted to tell you that you girls have it easy. I used to know a man back in the day that would play his piano until the sun was long gone. Then he would drag himself home with the blues still playing in his head. Life was hard back then. People were mistreated because of the color of the skin. Just awful stuff.
Do you need to talk about something?
What?
Which means you seem pretty depressed.
Hold on, now let's talk about this seriously for a second. What the man at the bar was talking about was none other than The Weary Blues by Langston Hughes.
The Weary Blues was written in 1923 in the midst of the Harlem Renaissance. It embodies all emotions that people were feeling, especially African Americans.
This is why it seems like there's so much sadness and sorrow, and why it's easy to assume that the writer is depressed.
Although sorrow of African Americans seems like the only message, the Weary Blues also shows the connection between the Harlem Renaissance, its poets, and jazz and blues music of that time.
In fact, in 1958, Charles Mingus and Langston Hughes collaborated to put the Weary Blues to blues music. It goes a little something like this.
And forth to a mellow croon. I heard a Negro play.
The connections to jazz and blues throughout the poem are easy to see, especially in the moaning of the piano, as if it were alive, and how the music showed a black man's soul.
Going back and breaking the poem down, it's easy to see how Hughes used this poem to portray themes that were common to this era of poetry, such as alienation, invisibility, and search for equality.
For example, the contrast between the player's ebony hands and the ivory keys of the piano. This shows how an African American has taken something that used to only sit in the parlors of rich white people to play Beethoven and Chopin and has claimed it as his own.
It's like he adopted it into his own culture, claimed it for all of the African Americans at the time, and said, "This is ours now too."
When you walk down the street of a big city, it's easy to pass by homeless people. Most people do it without batting an eye, as if they've become invisible. This invisibility is another thing that Hughes seems to bring up upon, but in this case, it's in regards to race.
Assuming that the player is African American and is playing as a performer in a club, it is most likely that the majority of the people watching were white. Having the performer on a rickety stool playing a raggedy tune and looking like a fool, he becomes portrayed as lower class and the other people in the club almost invisible.
This concept of invisibility is brought up in the end, but not as obviously. The performer plays until the stars go out and then trudges off to sleep exhausted, and yet no one seems to appreciate his playing.
Lastly, we have his reference to pressing on even though sometimes you feel like you can't. In another poem, Hughes says that in the black neighborhood, you had to be gay or die, which corresponds to the line in this poem, "I's gonna quit my frowning and put my troubles on the shelf."
And to counter that, the whole melancholy atmosphere of the poem corresponds to the lines from his other poem where he says that you can be sad too, because you couldn't help being sad sometimes.
Altogether, the Weary Blues is the Harlem Renaissance summed up into one poem. From the themes of invisibility and inequality to blues and jazz, it's all wrapped up in one neat package.
Con los terroristas.